if I told you that tiny plastic particles are lurking in your water, food, air, and yes, even your body? Microplastics have been found everywhere, from the deep ocean to human bloodstreams, and their impact on our health and the planet is only just beginning to be understood. But don't panic, there are ways to minimize your exposure, reduce their spread, and even help your body detox what's already inside. Hey everyone, Amber here, and welcome back to Sustainable Jungle, where we share sustainability tips, tricks, hacks, products, brands, and stories to better our planet. We're so glad that you're here because today we are deep diving into a problem that affects every single one of us, whether we even realize it or not, and that's microplastics. As I mentioned already, these tiny particles are everywhere, from the water that we drink to the food that we eat. And while there's a lot of different estimates out there as to how pervasive they actually are, one meta-analysis looked at 402 different data points from 26 of these studies and found that average annual microplastic consumption ranged from about 39,000 to 52,000 particles. Now, of course, these estimates increased to between 74,000 and 121,000 when inhalation was considered. So in today's video, I'm going to break down what microplastics are, where they come from, what their impact is, and sneak peek, they've been called by scientists a real global threat for environment and food safety. And then most importantly, we're going to talk about how we can minimize that impact on our health and the environment. So let's dive into our plastic-filled oceans, but first, go ahead and hit the like and subscribe buttons down below so you don't miss out on any of our future content. Okay, so what are microplastics? We hear the term all the time these days, but not everyone knows exactly what they are. Well, simply put, microplastics are small plastic particles that are less than 5 millimeters in diameter. Now, to put that in perspective, that's about the size of a grain of rice or smaller, but some are actually so small that the naked eye can't even really see them. Now, that brings us to the two main types of microplastics: primary and secondary. Primary microplastics are those that are deliberately created to be small. So you might find these in personal care products like toothpaste, synthetic cleaning products, or exfoliating scrubs. Though thankfully, since the Microbead-Free Waters Act of 2015, the US banned the manufacturing and distribution of rinse-off cosmetics containing these plastic microbeads. Not that that means that we don't still have them in some consumer products, but it's less prevalent than it used to be. So these are going to be tiny beads that do some of the work in these products. So they're meant to be exfoliators, they're meant to be scrubbers. But the thing is that once we wash them down the drain, they're not going to break down and they will stay in those water systems basically forever. So while it's not infallible, primary microplastics are at least relatively easy to control to some degree. Now, it's secondary microplastics that are much more insidious. So these are ones that come from larger plastic items that break down over time. So think plastic bottles, bags, even your synthetic clothes. Every time you wash your clothes, tiny fibers shed off of them and are washed out into the water, where they eventually break down into even smaller pieces. In fact, a 2021 study found that over 90% of plastic pollution in oceans come from products that break down into microplastics. And here's where things get tricky. Microplastics aren't just floating around in the environment. They're everywhere. They're in our landfills, rivers, oceans, our homes, and yes, our very bodies. And no wonder when they are everywhere all around us. And it's not just the plastic bottles and the bags and the clothing that we need to worry about. Microplastics also come from things that we don't really think about, like plastic cutting boards, synthetic carpets, and even synthetic rubber on shoes. So it's estimated that of all the microplastics out there in the world, 35% come from our clothing, 28% come from tires, and 37% from plastic waste that breaks down into those secondary microplastics. Okay, so microplastics are everywhere. That's been established. But what does that mean for us and the environment? Well, unfortunately, the answer isn't pretty. Microplastics pose serious risks to both human health and ecosystems. So first, let's talk about what we know about how microplastics affect humans. In a 2022 study, researchers found microplastics in 80% of human blood samples. That's right, microplastics in your blood. But it doesn't end there, because it seems like every time I go on the internet, there's some new study out about having found microplastics in human stool, breast milk, babies, vital organs, brains, and yes, even testicles. And while we don't fully understand the long-term effects, since this is a relatively new issue, or at least new in its degree of pervasiveness and our understanding of it, we can make some inferences from the research that it's nothing good. In a study using fish that were fed microplastics, scientists observed various possible issues, such as intestinal blockage and alterations, change in behavior, change in lipid metabolism, and most dangerous of all, transference to the liver. And that's an area that we actually have studied a little bit in humans, and researchers have found that accumulation of microplastics in the liver interfere with the liver's metabolism by disrupting lipid and bile acid, which can then lead to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and insulin resistance. And while there's not really a conclusive link for these next two yet, there is some research to suggest that microplastic ingestion is a potential risk factor for cardiovascular disease and linked to a decline in fertility, especially male fertility. Did I mention that we've also found them in testicles? And also, keep in mind that microplastics are often going to contain BPA and phthalates, which are known and quite well studied as disrupting hormone function, which you can find from all of these different resources that I'm going to link to below if you're curious to learn more. So we've got a clear problem on our hands, and it's not just humans suffering. The environmental toll of microplastics is even more alarming. In oceans, marine life is struggling. Microplastics have been found in at least 386 different aquatic species, from tiny plankton all the way up to whales that eat those plankton. And that's basically how this works. Animals ingest these particles, mistaking them for food, but when they eat the microplastics, they don't just clog up their digestive systems. They also introduce toxic chemicals into their bodies. And these animals are consumed by animals that are then higher up in the food chain, and the microplastics continue to accumulate, moving up that food chain and transferring toxins throughout the entire ecosystem. And yes, you guessed it, we eat seafood too. That means we could be consuming microplastics right along with our sushi or fish and chips. Plus, these microplastics can leach harmful chemicals into the soil, freshwater, and the ocean, which is going to impact ecosystems in ways that we don't even fully understand yet. From freshwater lakes to coral reefs, microplastics are causing damage that could take decades to reverse. Okay, so what can we do about microplastic contamination? Well, detoxifying the body from microplastics is still an emerging area of research, and while complete elimination methods are not yet established, certain approaches may help mitigate their presence and potential effects. Now, first, there's a drug called cholestyramine, and I think I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Cholestyramine.
But I had never heard of this before, but somebody in another one of our videos had commented asking me about it, so I did a little bit of digging. So cholestyramine is a bile acid sequestrant that is primarily used to lower cholesterol levels. And its mechanism involves binding to bile acids in the intestine, which are then excreted from the body. Now, ultimately, I found that specific studies demonstrating its efficacy in binding to and eliminating microplastics is currently lacking, but one study did find that it can reduce the amount of PFAS, or fluorocarbons, in the blood by some highly exposed people by 60% over a 12-week period. So that's good to know either way. Now, this general mechanism does suggest potential for it to assist in the removal of certain environmental contaminants from the body. However, it's important to note the effectiveness of it in binding to and eliminating microplastics specifically has not been established. Therefore, its use for microplastic detoxification remains completely theoretical and unproven. Plus, this is a prescription drug, so you can only get it through a doctor, and if you don't actually have high cholesterol, they might not prescribe it to you, but you could always talk to them to see. Now, if you don't want to mess with any prescriptions or really just any kind of medication that's designed for something else, so it might have adverse effects if you're using it not for that purpose, you can also try holistic dietary additions. So, like Spirulina and Chlorella. These are nutrient-rich algae known for their detoxifying properties, particularly in binding to heavy metals and certain toxins in the body. Now, I use both of these, especially my Spirulina here, primarily as an additive to smoothies because it's a really great source of chlorophyll, which studies have found can form close bonds to carcinogenic chemicals called aflatoxins. And when they bind, the chlorophyll helps block the absorption of the aflatoxins in the intestines. Regarding microplastics, some studies have explored their potential benefits. So chlorella may alleviate neurotoxic effects induced by microplastics. One study found that dietary supplementation of it reduced oxidative stress and inflammation in the brain caused by microplastic exposure. And while specific studies on spirulina's role in microplastic detoxification in humans is pretty limited, limited, spirulina has been used as a natural coagulant to remove polystyrene microplastics from water, indicating that it does have some degree of binding capabilities to these materials. Now, it's important to note that while these findings are promising, this is still a very emerging field of study, and direct evidence supporting the effectiveness of spirulina or chlorella in removing microplastics from the body is still very limited, and further research is necessary to kind of confirm that efficacy. But on the bright side, both of these powders are generally considered safe and low risk. I mean, it's basically just a dietary supplement. And while some studies have shown that some people have complained about diarrhea or nausea after taking them, they're pretty rare instances, and they're typically only associated with people taking really large dosages, which is harmful of literally anything, including water. I've never had an adverse reaction to these powders, but I do only take like half a teaspoon at a time. So if you do opt to try any of these, just do your research and ease yourself in to see how your body reacts. Now, activated charcoal is another option. So this has been studied to some extent as being able to remove 94% of BPA from water. So if you're worried about the BPA exposure from ingesting microplastics, an activated charcoal detox might be in order. This is something that even some doctors prescribe for certain toxins, and it's generally considered safe in low doses again, and in the short term only. So do it for a brief period of time and then give your body a break. Okay, so since it's fairly hard, if possible at all, we don't really know, to actively do anything to remove microplastics from our bodies, our best bet is going to be to stop putting them in there and avoid them where we can. Now, this is a two-pronged approach. First, we need to avoid consuming them, and then we need to avoid creating more of them to the extent that we're able. Let's start with the first one. Stop drinking from tea bags. So this is probably the easiest thing that you can do to severely prevent some major microplastic intake. Research indicates that some tea bags, particularly those made from synthetic materials like polypropylene, nylon, and cellulose, can release significant amounts of microplastics when steeped in hot water. In fact, one 2019 study showed a single plastic tea bag at brewing temperatures of 95 degrees Celsius releases approximately 11.6 billion microplastics and 3.1 billion nanoplastics into a single cup of the beverage. A slightly more recent study published in Chemisphere tested a few different tea bag materials, including nylon 6, polypropylene, PET, and cellulose, and found that the polypropylene bags shed the most microplastics, releasing about 1.2 billion small particles per millimeter of tea. Nylon 6 released 135 million, and cellulose released 8.2 million. Now, this begs the question, what about coffee filters? Well, while specific studies on microplastic release from paper coffee filters is limited, single-use plastic coffee pods and drip coffee bags, you know, the ones that look like the tea bags that you find in hotel rooms, have been shown to release microplastics. More than 10,000 microplastic particles into a cup of coffee when it's exposed to hot water for about 5 minutes. Now, it's of course worth pointing out that not all tea bags are made of these microplastic shedding materials. Some more sustainable tea companies are using cotton and the similar materials, but the problem is that it's really hard as a consumer to know sometimes. So, the safest bet, and the most sustainable, because tea bags are still single use, is to just opt for loose leaf tea, and for coffee, just to switch to a method that's bean only, like a filterless pour over or a French press. And while we're on the topic, plastic cups that you might drink those from is also a source of microplastics, to the tune of an annual exposure of anywhere from about 19,000 to 74,000 microplastics per person by the consumption of hot and cold beverages in disposable cups. So, don't forget your plastic-free to-go mug next time. Another really common source of microplastics that a lot of us don't even think about is our cutting board. Yep, every time that knife comes down, it's shaving up little microplastics that then go into the frying pan with your food. One study estimated that the per person annual exposure yielded about 7.4 to 50.7 grams of microplastics from a polyethylene cutting board and 49.5 grams from a polypropylene one. So instead, ditch the plastic cutting boards, use wood, glass, rubber, natural rubber specifically, or composite cutting boards. So for instance, I use a wooden cutting board for my bread, but I don't like to use wood for things that have a lot of moisture or bacteria, so basically any kind of meat, because wood's really notorious at trapping bacteria. So for things like that, I've been using this composite cutting board here, which is made of recycled wood pulp and paper, and then compressed into a resin that won't shed microplastics. The next thing you can do to reduce microplastic consumption is to filter your water and don't drink bottled. So remember that meta-analysis that I mentioned earlier about the total intake of particles? Well, they also found that individuals who met their recommended water intake only through bottled sources may be ingesting an additional 90,000 microplastics annually compared to 4,000 from those who only drink tap water. In fact, bottled water is the #1 source of microplastics among beverages, with 94.37 of them being found per gram per cubic meter, with beer being a not-so-close second at just 32.27. So, as if we need another reason to give up disposable plastic bottles. Now, tap water is considered much safer than bottled in terms of microplastic exposure, with just 4.42 microplastics found per gram per cubic meter. But you can actually cut this exposure down even further by just investing in a simple water filter or filtration system like a reverse osmosis filter that I have here. So I use this countertop row pot, and no, I didn't buy it just for the punny name, but I do appreciate it. And it has a 4-stage filtration system in it, and the first one is the microparticle filter, so this is the thing that's going to capture microplastics. In general, RO filters are considered effective at trapping larger than 0.05 microns of contaminants, but some sources say that they can filter out nanoparticles down to the 0.0001 micron level, just not as reliably. But it is the most effective filter option currently available, and I say that some is better than none. Now about seafood. So as we've touched on already, microplastics are making their way into basically everything, but they are especially pervasive in the marine food chain. In one USA-based study, anthropogenic debris like microplastics were found in 25% of individual fish, 33% of shellfish, and 67% of all species. And research has shown that microplastics can very easily transfer from the fish gut to the fillet flesh that then people eat. So now, unless you're vegan or vegetarian, which if you are, good for you, it can be tough to avoid seafood entirely, but you can take steps to make smarter choices. So first of all, you can try to buy seafood that's sustainably sourced, preferably from clean waters or eco-certified fisheries. You could also be extra careful with shellfish due to the way they filter feed, which is why they are generally known to have more microplastics than regular fish. And unfortunately, it doesn't really matter if we're talking about fresh or saltwater species, because microplastics have been found really extensively in both. In fact, back in 2015, a brown bullhead trout that was pulled from Lake Ontario was found to have 915 plastic particles within it. Now, I grew up fishing in small mountain lakes with my grandpa, so it's an activity that's very precious to me, and now I try to do it as much as I can because I know exactly where my fish is coming from, and in some of these really small lakes, the microplastic exposure is going to be way less pervasive of an issue when you're talking about remote mountain waterways. Next, be cautious of nonstick cookware. So as we've covered in another video on the topic, there's a lot of reasons to avoid traditional Teflon-esque coatings, namely that they're full of fluorocarbons, aka forever chemicals that linger in the environment and human bodies to detrimental effects. But aside from all those toxins that those coatings can emit into the air when they're heated to high temperatures, these coatings can also get scratched or flake off over time, which shed these tiny plastic particles into your food when they do. So instead, choose something like stainless steel, cast iron, or ceramic-coated cookware like this thing here, which does not release harmful chemicals or microplastics when it gets scratched. Now let's talk a little bit about how to avoid producing microplastics. And the first and most important thing that you can do is to wear more natural fiber clothes and home textiles. So as we've touched on, synthetic fibers are a huge source of microplastics, particularly polyester and nylon being major culprits. So did you know that washing a single load of synthetic clothes can release thousands of tiny plastic fibers into the water supply? In fact, each cycle of a washing machine could release more than 700,000 plastic fibers into the environment. And some types of synthetic fibers are especially notorious at shedding these, like polyester fleece. It's estimated that each time a fleece garment is washed, it releases up to 1,900 bits of plastic for one garment alone. Or, since weight is a little bit easier to visualize here, 1.7 grams. So instead, when you're shopping for new clothes, look for natural fibers such as cotton, wool, linen, hemp. These fibers will not shed plastic, and they're biodegradable when you finally wear through the garment. Now, I know it's completely unrealistic to just say, yeah, swap your entire closet with natural clothing. Even I don't do that. I still wear plenty of synthetic garments, whether it's activewear that I have that's made of recycled synthetics or just old synthetic clothes that I've owned for years and years and will continue to wear because that's the most sustainable thing we can do with our wardrobes. So for these things, invest in a microfiber catching wash bag like the Guppy Friend or a washing machine filter. Now, the wash bags are a great place to start because it's basically just a super fine mesh bag that is designed to trap the fibers so they don't end up in our oceans. They're not a huge upfront investment. A Guppy Friend is like $40, so it's a pretty easy step if you want to get into preventing microplastics, but you don't want to go with a little bit more of an intense solution. But there are a lot of other options too, and more that are hitting the market with each year. And these are ones that I personally have not tried, but you've got things like the Coraball, which supposedly tangles the microfibers around its structure. There's also an increasing amount of direct to washer install options out there, like the Gulp, Filtrol, Lint Lover, and Planet Care. And honestly, I'm definitely thinking of upgrading to one of these if it's compatible with my machine, which FYI, I have a combo washer dryer, so it's a little different than most. But honestly, I'm kind of at the point where I just think the bags are a little bit of a pain because you have to sort all of your garments into one. Sometimes if you have a big load of synthetics, they don't all fit. So I either have to cram them in which case things don't get very clean, or you have to run multiple loads, which sometimes defeats the sustainability point. So while I think that wash bags are really great for a few items, or even great if you don't have your own washing machine, like say you rent or you have to do public laundry, but for me where I own my washing machine, I'm definitely exploring a filter this year. And on the subject of laundry, stop using dissolvable plastics. I'm looking at you, PLA and PVA. So, short for polylactic acid and polyvinyl alcohol, these are both forms of bioplastic that are marketed as biodegradable and dissolvable, except they aren't really. We've done a whole dive into PVA specifically because it's really prevalent in the use of eco-friendly products. So I'm going to link to that article down below if you want more information on that material specifically. But basically, unless you're putting these bioplastics into a really specific environment in which they are designed to break down completely, they're just not going to disappear from the environment. In fact, PVA specifically has a very poor biodegradation rate in wastewater treatment systems. You know, where all those laundry detergent sheets and dishwasher pods end up. And instead, they result in microplastic pollution. In a study by Newcastle University that looked at microplastic ingestion by inhabitants of deep ocean trenches, PVA was among the types of plastics found in these marine creatures. So, to prevent this, let's stop flushing plastics of any kind down the drain thinking they're dissolvable. This means no flushable wipes, which, by the way, experts widely agree you should never flush anyway. No laundry detergent sheets or pods, no dishwasher pods, unless it's from a brand like Blueland, which makes PVA-free ones. And you can see the difference in the lack of coating between these two different pods. Now, you can also try to make your own DIY pod versions of these, which I will link to some resources for you on how to do down below. And finally, just reduce single-use plastic and be mindful of your plastic consumption, period. Things like straws, cutlery, water bottles are some of the biggest contributors to microplastic pollution. So instead, let's switch to reusable alternatives like stainless steel or bamboo straws, reusable cutlery, you know, all that stuff that you have a ton of in your silverware drawer already, and water bottles made of stainless steel or glass. Heck, just glass jars. This reduces the need for single-use plastic products that will eventually break down into those secondary microplastics. But let's be real. Even with all the steps that we take, there's still going to be in our environment, in our food, and possibly in our bodies. This is a global issue, and there's no one perfect solution to it right now. But the more that we can reduce our personal impact, the better. And as with all things sustainability and low-tox living, we need to approach this realistically, knowing that we are probably never going to completely expunge our microplastic intake or output. As we say here at Sustainable Jungle all the time, progress over perfection. Just because we can't completely solve the microplastic solution single-handedly, that's no excuse to not do what we can. Because you know what? If we all do just that, just a little bit, well, suddenly that adds up to a whole lot less. And one of the most important things you can do is to stay informed. Microplastics are still a relatively new area of research, so new studies and solutions are constantly emerging in this field. Now, I want to go over to you. What do you think about this issue? Let me know in the comments below, maybe with your tips on reducing microplastic waste and exposure. And if you found this video helpful, be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to know more about microplastics. Until next time, this is Amber from SJ, wishing you all a microplastic-free day.